The laughter of the guests floated through the gilded ballroom like distant music, but Lady Marguerite Ashworth heard only the silence wrapped around her like a shroud. She stood near the marble pillar, her champagne untouched, her gown the soft blush of a fading rose. No one spoke to her. No one even looked at her. She had been the Duchess of Wickliffe for 5 years, and yet tonight, as on so many nights, she was invisible. Her husband, Lucian Ashworth, the Duke of Wickliffe, stood across the room with his broad shoulders turned slightly away from her. He was deep in conversation with Lord and Lady Pemberton, his profile sharp and aristocratic, that familiar coolness resting easily on his features. He had not glanced at his wife once since they entered the ballroom. His neglect was a quiet, precise blade that cut a little deeper each time she breathed. Marguerite had learned to hold herself still, to let the loneliness settle without flinching. Her gloved fingers tightened around the crystal stem, and she placed the glass on a passing tray with a smile that hurt to hold. She was not angry. Anger required hope, and hope had long since abandoned her. A group of young ladies nearby whispered behind their fans. One of them, Miss Eliza Crane, giggled softly and said, just loud enough to carry, "It must be so humiliating to be married to a man who never speaks your name. I would simply die." Another murmured, "The Duke is still in love with Lady Celeste. Everyone knows it. The Duchess is merely a duty." The words curled through the air like frost, and Marguerite's heart clenched, but she kept her gaze level. She had heard such things before. She would hear them again. The worst part was not the cruelty of strangers. The worst part was the truth buried inside their whispers. Lucian did not love her. He never had. When the clock struck the hour, Lucian finally turned and walked toward her. For a fleeting second, her foolish heart lifted. He moved with the grace of a man who commanded every room he entered. His dark hair was swept back, his eyes, gray as winter storms, fixed somewhere just past her shoulder. He stopped before her, and the scent of cedar and cold night air clung to him. "The carriage is ready," he said, his voice low and empty of any warmth. "I have business early tomorrow. We should leave." She nodded, not trusting her voice. They departed without a single word more. As they descended the grand staircase, Marguerite saw their reflection in a tall mirror, a distant, beautiful couple who shared nothing but a name. She looked at the woman in the glass and barely recognized the quiet, fatting thing she had become. The ride home through the dark, rain-slicked streets of London was silent. Lucian stared out the window, his jaw tight. Marguerite watched the raindrops trace sorrowful lines down the glass and remembered a different night, 5 years ago, when she had ridden to Wickliffe Manor for the first time as a bride. She had been so full of desperate, tender hope. Her father had arranged the match to settle a crippling debt between their families, but Marguerite, young and romantic, had believed that love could grow. She had imagined quiet evenings by the fire, shared laughter, the slow, sweet collision of two lonely hearts. She had been utterly wrong. Lucian had been polite but distant from the very start. On their wedding night, he had simply told her, "This is a union of necessity. I will give you my name and my protection. I cannot give you anything more." And like a fool, she had tried anyway. For years, she had planned elaborate dinners he never attended, left flowers in his study that wilted unnoticed, practiced conversation topics that died the moment she saw the indifference in his eyes. She had poured every ounce of her affection into a void that never once echoed back. Now, at 24, she was exhausted. The well of her longing had run dry. The next morning, Marguerite rose early. The gray dawn light crept into her bedchamber as she penned a letter to her younger sister in the countryside, a letter in which she carefully hid all traces of her unhappiness. She dressed simply, a gown of dove-gray muslin, and pinned her chestnut hair with steady hands. Today marked 5 years since she had become Duchess of Wickliffe. She had prepared a small gift for Lucian, a rare orchid she had cultivated herself in the conservatory, a blossom the color of moonlight with a faint, sweet perfume. It was a tiny, hopeful gesture, the last ember of a fire she could no longer sustain. She found him in his study, already immersed in estate papers. He did not look up when she entered. "Lucian," she said softly, and the name tasted like a prayer that had never been answered. He raised his eyes briefly, and they held no light for her. Yes. She held out the small potted orchid, her fingers trembling just slightly. I wanted to give you this. It bloomed this morning. I thought you might like it for your desk. He glanced at the delicate petals, and something unreadable flickered across his face. Annoyance, perhaps, or the weariness of a man constantly burdened by unwanted affection. I don't have time for flowers, Marguerite. His tone was dismissive, quiet, but it landed like a stone. Please, I have a great deal to attend to. The orchid trembled in her hands. She stood there for a moment too long, the silence stretching thin, until she simply placed the pot on the edge of his vast mahogany desk. He did not touch it. He did not thank her. He turned a page and she ceased to exist. Marguerite walked out of the study and closed the door with a soft click that sounded like the end of something. She did not cry. Her tears had been spent long ago in the dark hours before dawn when no one could hear. Instead, she felt a strange, hollow calm settle over her. The ember had gone out. She no longer hoped. She no longer would try. From this moment, she would stop seeking a love that was never meant for her. That afternoon, she walked down to the glass houses at the far end of Wycliffe's sprawling gardens. The estate was magnificent, a vast, ancient place of honey-colored stone and emerald lawns, but the glass houses had fallen into neglect decades ago. They had become Marguerite's sanctuary. Over the past year, she had slowly, quietly begun to restore them, coaxing life from the cold soil, tending fragile seedlings with the same tenderness she had once wasted on a man who saw her as a shadow. Here, among the ferns and the rare, delicate blooms, she felt almost whole. The head gardener, an elderly man named Mr. Finch, had become a gentle friend. That day, he introduced her to a visitor, a botanist named Dr. Nathaniel Thorne, who had come to study Wycliffe's collection of exotic plants. Nathaniel was a kind-faced man in his early 30s, with warm brown eyes and the gentle hands of someone who spent his life nurturing living things. When he spoke to her, he actually saw her. His gaze didn't slip past her, didn't glaze with disinterest. He listened when she talked about soil acidity and light requirements with genuine fascination. "Your Grace," he said after they had walked through the humid warmth of the orchid house, "you have a rare gift. These plants thrive because of the care you give them. It is a beautiful thing to witness." Marguerite felt a rush of color in her cheeks, a warmth she had almost forgotten. "They are easier to understand than people," she admitted softly. "They never pretend. They simply need light and time." Nathaniel smiled, and there was no pity in it, only respect. Perhaps people need the same things but are too afraid to ask. Those words stayed with her as she returned to the manor. For the first time in years, she felt a tiny, defiant spark of something that might have been self-worth. That evening, she did not wait for Lucien in the drawing room. She did not hover near the door, hopping for a shared meal. Instead, she ate a quiet supper in her chambers and read a book on botanical cultivation until the candle burned low. She would no longer orbit around a sun that gave her no warmth. Lucien noticed the change, but slowly, as a man notices a shift in the wind only after it has already altered the weather. It began with small absences. The drawing room felt emptier in the evenings. He no longer heard the soft rustle of her gown in the corridor outside his study, the hesitant footsteps that always paused as if gathering courage before moving on. At first, he attributed the silence to relief. At last, she had stopped pestering him with her quiet, hopeful presence. But after a week, the silence began to prickle. One evening, he attended a dinner at the home of a political ally without her. He had not even asked if she wished to come, assuming she would be waiting, as always, to be summoned. But when he returned to Wycliffe, the house was dark save for a single light burning far off in the conservatory. He stood at the window of his study, watching the distant glow, and felt an unfamiliar twist of irritation. What could she possibly be doing out there at such an hour? The next day, he saw her walking across the lawn with a man he did not recognize. They were laughing together, their heads bent close over a notebook. Marguerite's face was animated, open, glowing in the pale sunlight in a way Lucien had never seen. The man, tall and simply dressed, pointed to something in the glass house, and she touched his sleeve with easy familiarity. The sight of her fingers resting there sent a sharp, inexplicable bolt of something hot through Lucian's chest. He turned from the window, jaw clenched, and told himself it was merely the surprise of seeing his quiet wife so lively with a stranger. It was nothing more. But it was not nothing. That afternoon he summoned Mr. Finch and demanded to know who the gentleman was. "Dr. Nathaniel Thorne, your grace," the gardener replied, looking puzzled. "A respected botanist. Her grace has been assisting him with his research. She is quite knowledgeable." The gardener hesitated, then added, "It's good to see her smile again, if I may say so. She's been a bit of a ghost these past years." Ghost. The word haunted Lucian. He dismissed the gardener and stood rigidly in his study, surrounded by leather-bound ledgers and cold duty. He tried to focus on accounts, but his mind kept returning to the image of his wife's hand on another man's arm. He had never cared who she saw or spoke to. He had never given it a thought. So why did this feel like a betrayal? The question unsettled him so deeply that he pushed it away with the same iron discipline he used on all inconvenient emotions. Days turned into weeks, and Marguerite continued to bloom in her quiet, separate world. She stopped attending the small social gatherings Lucian occasionally hosted, sending polite, elegant notes of regret. She spent hours in the glass houses, her skin kissed by sun and soil, her laughter echoing through the humid air like a forgotten song. She began to wear brighter colors, not for anyone else, but because they pleased her. The pale, faded creature in the mirror was slowly being replaced by a woman with steady eyes and a calm heart. The ton began to whisper again, but this time the whispers were different. "The Duchess of Wycliffe has become rather fascinating," Lady Pemberton remarked at a tea. "She hardly ever appears in society, yet I hear she is doing remarkable work restoring those old gardens, and Dr. Thorne, the botanist, speaks of her with such admiration." The unspoken question lingered. Why did her husband never seem to accompany her? Why did the Duke look so grim at the mere mention of her name? Lucian heard the murmurs. They scraped at him like sand. At a club one evening, a younger Lord Sir Charles Bentley leaned over with a knowing smile and said, "Your wife is causing quite a stir, Ashworth. Several gentlemen have noted her transformation. It seems she is no longer hiding in your shadow." The tone was teasing, but the words lit a fire of possessive fury in Lucian's gut. He set his glass down with a force that made the liquid slosh. "My wife's activities are her own affair," he said coldly. But he knew it was a lie. She was still his wife, and the thought of other men noticing her, admiring her, wanting her, was suddenly unbearable. He tried to bridge the gap, but his attempts were clumsy, like a man learning to speak a language he had scorned for years. One evening he waited for her in the great hall as she returned from the gardens, her cheeks flushed with exertion, a smudge of dirt on her temple. "Marguerite," he said, and the name felt foreign on his tongue from disuse. She stopped, surprised. "Yes. I thought we might dine together tonight." Her expression did not brighten. It merely softened into something polite and distant. "I'm afraid I have already made plans to review botanical sketches with Dr. Thorne in the library. He is cataloging specimens and requires my assistance. Perhaps another evening." She gave a small, courteous nod and walked past him, leaving the faint scent of jasmine and damp earth in her wake. He stood frozen, the sting of her refusal sharper than any blade. She had once longed for his company. She had once waited hours for a single word. Now she was too busy living a life that no longer included him. The realization was a cold, creeping dread that wrapped around his ribs and squeezed. Later that night, unable to sleep, Lucian found himself in the dim library. On the central table lay the botanical sketches, detailed and exquisite, drawn in Marguerite's delicate hand. Beside them was a small pot holding an orchid, the same moon-colored blossom she had offered him weeks ago. He had left it on his desk, ignored until a maid had probably placed it here. It was still alive, still beautiful. Because she had cared for it even after he had rejected it. The sight of it now, thriving without him, broke something inside his chest. He had been so cold, so wrapped in his own bitterness, that he had thrown away the one pure, unselfish love that had ever been offered to him. The next day he sought out his steward, an old, loyal man named Grimsby, with questions about the estate's financial history. He had been going through old records, troubled by gaps he had never bothered to examine closely. What he uncovered rocked him to his core. 5 years ago, Wycliffe had been on the brink of ruin, secret debts accrued by his late father that would have stripped the family of everything. The marriage to Marguerite's family had brought a substantial settlement, but Lucien had always believed the money was a simple dowry, the price of a titled match for a gentleman's daughter. Now, looking at the original ledgers, he saw the truth. The entire settlement had been funneled directly to cover the debts, saving Wycliffe from disgrace. And Marguerite's father had insisted the matter remain hidden to protect the Duke's pride. But there was more. Tucked into a false bottom of an old strongbox, Grimsby found a letter addressed to Lucien, dated 6 months after his marriage, bearing the handwriting of Lady Celeste, the woman Lucien had once believed was the great, tragic love of his life. Celeste, who had rejected him for a wealthier earl. The letter, sealed and never sent, was a confession that she had made a mistake, that she still loved him, that she wished to see him again. And it had been intercepted before it ever reached his hands. A note in Marguerite's writing was attached to it, addressed to her own father. "I have kept this from him. He suffered enough because of her. She would only wound him again. I will protect him from this pain, even if he never knows." Lucien's hands shook as he read it. Marguerite had sacrificed her own chance, perhaps her only chance, to use that letter as a weapon or a release. She could have shown it to him, let him run back to Celeste, and freed herself from a loveless marriage. Instead, she had quietly, fiercely protected the man who had never offered her a shred of tenderness. She had loved him when he was utterly undeserving of it, and he had repaid her with years of cold indifference. The weight of his guilt was a physical pain. He sank into the chair by the cold fireplace, the papers scattered around him like leaves from a poisoned tree. He thought of the orchid, of her hopeful, trembling hands, of the light dying from her eyes. He had extinguished that light. He had made her a ghost in her own life. He had to find her. He had to speak, but the words were a tangled knot in his throat. That evening the house was quiet. He searched for her in the conservatory, in the library, in her chambers. She was nowhere. A footman informed him that her Grace had been invited to a small musical evening at Dr. Thorne's rented cottage in the village. She would return late. Lucien felt a rush of cold panic. She was with him again. The botanist who looked at her as if she were the sun. A man who had done nothing but appreciate her, support her, draw her out of the shell Lucien had built around her. He waited in the dark, silent hall, the great clock ticking away the seconds of his reckoning. When the carriage finally rolled up the graveled drive and Marguerite stepped inside, her cheeks pink from laughter and evening air, she stopped short at the sight of him. "Lucien, is something wrong?" He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in years. The soft curve of her jaw, the quiet strength in her posture, the way her eyes, once so full of longing, now regarded him with calm, guarded patience. She was no longer the woman who would crumble at his indifference. She had become someone who could stand alone, and the thought that he might have lost her completely made his voice break. "Marguerite, I need to speak with you, please." She hesitated, then nodded, removing her gloves with slow, deliberate movements. They went into the drawing room and he closed the door. The silence between them was heavy with all the words never said. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and ragged. "I found the letter, Celeste's letter, and the note you wrote. I know what you did." Her face paled, but she did not flinch. "I did not want you to be hurt again," she said quietly. "She would have broken you a second time. I could not allow that." "You should have let me go to her," he said, the words scraping out of him. "You could have been free. You could have found someone who deserved you." "I did not want to be free," she whispered. "I wanted you, but you never wanted me, and I have accepted that now. I have made my peace." The quiet dignity in her voice undid him. Lucien crossed the room and stood before her, his controlled, aristocratic mask finally shattered. "I was a fool," he said. his voice thick with an emotion he had never allowed himself to feel. "I was so wrapped in wounded pride and resentment over a love that was never true that I became blind. I treated you as a duty because I was too proud to admit that you terrified me. You were kind and good and everything I did not deserve. I pushed you away because I was afraid of being seen. And now I see that I have destroyed the only real love I have ever known." Marguerite's eyes glistened, but she held his gaze without wavering. "I stopped hopping, Lucien. I had to, or I would have faded away entirely. You cannot simply undo 5 years of silence with a few words." "I know." He reached out slowly, as if she were a rare, precious bloom that might shatter at a careless touch. His fingers brushed her hand, and he felt the slight tremble there. "But I will spend every day of the rest of my life trying. I will wait as long as you need. I will stand outside your glass houses until the roots of your heart grow toward me again. Just do not turn away from me yet, please." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she did not pull her hand away. It was not a grand, sweeping forgiveness. It was the faintest crack of dawn after an endless night. But it was something. The days that followed were tentative, delicate. Lucien did not crowd her. He simply began to be present. He brought her tea in the conservatory and sat in patient silence while she worked. He asked about her plants, and this time he listened. He returned to the drawing room in the evenings, not to read alone, but to be near her. He wrote her a letter, a real, sprawling, ink-stained confession of all the things he should have said years ago, and left it on her pillow. She read it 3 times, her heart aching and thawing in equal measure. One afternoon, he found her in the orchid house, alone, the golden light filtering through the glass like a benediction. She was tending the same moon-colored orchid she had once offered him, now flourishing in a larger pot. He came to stand beside her, his shoulder almost brushing hers. "I remember the day you gave this to me," he said softly. "I was a monster." "You were lost," she corrected, her voice gentle, "and I was invisible." He turned to her, his gray eyes no longer winter but something warmer, a storm finally passing. "You have never been invisible to me. I saw you every day, and I was too stubborn to admit that my soul reached for you in every silent moment. I loved you too late, Marguerite, but I love you now with everything I am." She looked up at him and saw the truth raw and unguarded on his face. The wall between them, built stone by cold stone over years, began to crumble. "It is not too late," she whispered. "It is just the end of a very long winter." When he kissed her, it was gentle, reverent, a seal upon a new covenant. It tasted of rain and new leaves and the fragile hope that love, no matter how wounded, could still take root. Summer came to Wycliffe with a riot of blossoms. The glass houses, fully restored, became the talk of the county, but they remained Marguerite's private kingdom, and now often Lucien's refuge as well. He would find her there in the soft evenings, and they would walk among the perfumed shadows, hands intertwined, speaking of small, precious things. The whispers of the Tun changed once more, but now they told a different story, of a duke who had discovered that true love was not the grand, dramatic passion of youth, but the quiet, steadfast devotion that waited patiently in the soil of everyday life. And on the anniversary of that darkest day, the day he had dismissed her gift and broken her heart, Lucien led Marguerite back to the orchid house. There, on the old wooden bench, rested a new pot, an orchid of deepest, velvety amethyst, a variety she had never seen before. "I had it grown for you," he said, his voice unsteady. "A new bloom for a new beginning. I will never let another day pass without you knowing how precious you are." Marguerite touched the petals with trembling fingers, and then she turned and wrapped her arms around him, her cheek pressed to his chest where she could feel the strong, steady beat of his heart. She had stopped hopping once, but now hope had returned, not as a desperate, clinging thing, but as a quiet, unshakable certainty. She was loved. She was seen. And as the last rays of the sun gilded the glass around them, the Duke of Wycliffe held his wife as if she were the most exquisite treasure in the world, because she was, and always had been, the very heartbeat of his soul.